Good evening. Okay. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Friedman from Rockefeller University as tonight's Silverstein speaker. The Silverstein Lecture Series was made possible by a generous gift from Herman and Bea Silverstein to the Center for Genetic Medicine here at Northwestern University to help promote education of the general public about advances in genetics and medicine. And I'm confident that tonight's talk by Dr. Friedman will be the perfect embodiment of that goal, because Dr. Friedman's work has used genetic approaches to take apart the remarkably complex but very important pathways that control weight in humans. And as we know, weight in humans is a huge both health issue and social issue that affects tens of millions of people and costs many billions of dollars. And I am convinced at the end of this lecture that you will come away from this with a better understanding of how genetics contributes to the problem of obesity and weight in general. Now, we invited Dr. Friedman to give this talk because his work has profoundly changed how we think about a fundamental problem in biology and in medicine. And not so coincidentally, this is among the criteria that is used by the committee that decides on the Lasker Awards. The Lasker Award, as you may or may not know, is this country's most distinguished honor for recognizing important research in both basic and clinical research in medical sciences. And approximately 2 weeks ago, Dr. Friedman, along with Dr. Douglas Coleman, were recognized with the 2010 Lasker Award for the discovery of leptin, which you will hear much more about tonight. Now, Dr. Friedman has received many, many awards, which I could tell you about, but I won't, because I think we should actually hear what Dr. Friedman has to say and talk about the research that he has done, which he has been most appropriately recognized for. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Friedman, and welcome, and thank you.
Okay, as Greg told you, I'm going to talk to you about the clinical problem of obesity. And I thought I'd begin with an image of a thin child and an obese child. If we could turn the lights down in the front, maybe. An image of an obese child that you can see, and an image of a less obese, of a lean child that you may or may not be able to see. And I thought I'd begin with this image to ask each of you to think to yourselves for a moment about what the causes of this might be. And what your reactions to these children or the adults that they would grow into would be with respect to what the causes might be, what the remedies might be, or in the case of children, what the responsibility of the parents are for seeing that their children achieve what we consider to be a lean and healthy state. And so my job tonight is, to the best of my ability, to try to deconstruct obesity for you and at least share my views on what its causes are. And so to do that, I'm going to talk first about the causes of obesity. I'll then tell you about this hormone leptin that we discovered and how it's informed our thinking about what regulates body weight. And then if there's time, I'll tell you a research vignette about some current work in which we modulate the activity of specific neurons and can show important changes in the behavior of an animal, though I'm not sure there'll be time for that or not. Now, I have a great challenge in talking to you about obesity to an extent that I wouldn't have if I were talking about any other medical condition. And that's because were I to ask, were someone here speaking before you about any of these other topics, and you were asked, well, what causes these problems or what the remedies are, you would probably defer to whoever it was that was speaking. That's not true for obesity for a number of reasons, including the fact that this problem is discussed with almost constancy in the lay press. This subject is one about which almost everyone has a deeply held opinion about its causes and what its remedies might be. I think part of the reason for this is, as I show here, it's covered so prominently in the lay press. But it's also because we all have such a deep set of personal experiences in our own lives and our families, eating, not eating, dieting, not dieting, that almost everyone has a deeply held set of beliefs that I think more often than not lead people to completely disregard what it is I have to say. But that's not going to stop me. I'll continue anyway. Now, whatever one's views about the causes of obesity or its remedies, there's no getting around the fact that it's a major public health problem. And that's because, for reasons we don't fully understand, obesity increases the relative risk of a set of disorders: heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, fatty liver, even some forms of cancer, that are the principal causes of morbidity and mortality in the Western world. And the extent of this problem can be seen in this prospective study that was done about a decade ago, in which the relative risk of death was increased as body mass index, an indicator of adiposity or obesity, increases. So just pay attention to the magenta lines here. And what you'll see here is BMI exceeds 30. I'll tell you exactly what this means in a minute. Mortality increases. And so everyone at some level asks themselves the following question. If an individual finds themselves here on this continuum with an increased relative risk of disease and death, and moreover suffering from social stigma that lead obese people to make less money and be promoted less readily than their no better qualified lean counterparts, why don't obese people just lose the weight and come down to the part of this curve where the stigma will be minimized and their health will improve, or the risk of death will improve? And I think that's the question, in a sense, that underpins much about the late coverage of this subject. And as a general statement, I would say that there are three general explanations that are put forward to explain why people are obese, and moreover why it is, once obese, they don't return to this flat, more salubrious part of the curve. The first explanation would be that the obese lack some level of willpower or personal or self-control that's manifest in lean people. I find this point of view more often favored among lean people. A second possibility is lifestyle and environment, that we live in a toxic environment where no one exercises, everyone eats the wrong kinds of food, and that accounts for this increase in obesity and the inability of obese patients to lose weight. And the third possibility is biology and genes, that there are biological differences between the obese and the lean that make the obese so and the lean so. Now, at various times, I've often asked people, well, let's do it. Let's ask for a vote. Who thinks the most important contributor to this is lack of willpower? It's a very enlightened audience. Who thinks it's lifestyle and environment? Okay, and who thinks it's biology and genes? Okay, and who really thinks it's willpower? It's like Simon says here. Well, I used to take the vote after I was finished speaking, but I found occasionally that fewer people would vote for biology or genes when I was done. So that's the last vote I'll take. But what I do want to emphasize is that were I talking about any other condition, people would immediately gravitate to the idea that there's a biological system that underpins it, and that the biology can be modified by environmental and behavioral factors. Now, I didn't really set up the question in the fairest way to ask you to vote for that possibility. But for reasons, again, that I think have partly to do with the coverage in the lay press, debate on this or consideration of this problem is completely polarized, where people feel compelled to pick one more often than not, or the other, when in fact I think there's a more unified and comprehensive view that one can take. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, what I'm going to do now is briefly track through what I believe to be the case for a significant contribution of willpower, lifestyle, and environment, and genes. So let's talk first about willpower. You've heard the message often: obese people eat too much and exercise too little. I'll come back to both those attributes in a minute. And the suggestion has been made in any number of infomercials. One mock infomercial shown here, created for me by the Howard Hughes Institute, suggests how we might use this to fix the problem.
Are you tired of being overweight? Tired of the latest weight loss fads? Wouldn't you like a plan that just works? Well, now it's easy. Just follow the Kant-Miss weight loss program and you too can be slim and trim. Just follow our simple meal plans and your extra pounds will disappear like magic. If you really want to lose weight, decide now to follow the Kant-Miss weight loss program.
So That's willpower. Decide now, and you don't have to be heavy unless you choose to be. What's not readable there is scrolling at the bottom is the fact that the success of these plans has to be made public to people who view it, and the success of these plans is rather limited. I'll come back to the numbers in a minute, but I'll just tell you that there's a reasonable explanation for why willpower is of limited value for this. And that has to do with the fact that every living organism has to obey the laws of thermodynamics, which posits that the amount of energy stored won't change unless energy into or output from the system also changes. So this is the law of conservation of energy. So what that means is that in each of us, if your weight is stable for a given year, during that same interval, the amount of food you ate would have to be precisely balanced against the amount of energy you burn. And weight is remarkably stable year in on year out for people who are not actively trying to change their weight. Quite naturally, it just stays at the same place, and this has been shown in studies in South Africa, Sweden, Israel, and elsewhere. And what this requires then is over the course of a year in which you may have consumed 1 million calories, that would have had to have been precisely balanced against 1 million calories burned. These numbers get even more profound if you think about food consumption over the course of a decade, during which the average person will have consumed tons worth of fat, protein, and carbohydrate, converting that to waste, heat, and a small amount of work, all the while maintaining a relatively constant weight. Now, if you take into account that in many cases there's a 10-pound weight gain per decade, if you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation with these massive numbers, what you conclude is that that the number of calories taken in over the course of a decade were balanced precisely against the calories burned, with approximately 99.6% precision. This is a level of precision that exceeds by logs the number of calories that a dietitian could sort of surmise is in the food you eat, and even exceeds the precision with which calorie counts are shown on food labels. And so here are the error rates of different foods you might eat, comparing now what's shown on the label as compared to what you find if you just do calorimetry on them. So the point here is that it would appear that nature, that individuals maintain their weight more or less naturally with a greater precision than you would ever see if you assiduously follow the food labels. Now, this line of reasoning has been put forth for more than 100 years, and it suggested to many that in fact food intake is regulated by a basic drive, that somehow there are mechanisms in each living organism that monitor the number of calories that individual carries and tries to maintain them at an optimal level. It's very easy to see the activity of this putative system in animals. In an experiment of this sort, animals are overfed through a tube for a period of time, and during that period of time, because they're forcibly overfed, they gain weight. Their voluntary intake over that interval goes down, but importantly, when you remove the tube and the animal now finds itself heavier, it continues to eat less until such time as its weight returns to that of a control group. Same is true if you food restrict an animal, body weight will fall, but as soon as you restore the food, the weight of those animals returns to the starting point. As if in both cases the animal somehow knows it's gotten fatter and now counter-regulates to return weight to the starting point, accounting in a sense for this precision. Now, what I'm suggesting based on this is that there might be a biological system that seeks to maintain relative constancy of weight. And if we now think about what dieting does, in a sense, is to try to overcome the basic drive or resist it. Now, there are many instances in which a basic drive is set in opposition to a conscious wish. In a sense, that's what addiction can be about. Now, for all of our basic drives, they play out over various time frames. And so everyone intuitively accepts that it's not possible to consciously stop breathing. Sooner or later, the basic drive will supervene. And it's because that drive becomes evidence in seconds or minutes, so it overcomes our conscious wish. Now, the problem for these other behaviors is that the potency of the basic drive plays out over a much longer period of time, so that as the drive gets to eat or restore your weight, as I showed you in the animal, gets more and more potent, it's removed from the onset of the diet, and so that people assume that it's a lack of willpower rather than simply a basic drive playing out over a long period of time. Now, the fact that there's a basic drive evident in animals and almost certainly in human that plays out to to sort of resist your best efforts to lose weight that explains the fact that most diets fail. 70 to 95% of diets in which people have lost substantial amounts of weight fail with the patients returning to their pre-dieting weight in about a year or two, accounting for the time frame I showed you a moment ago. So while dieting can be a powerful way to lose weight in the short term, usually it elicits a set of counter-regulatory changes that over the course of a longer period of time lead them to fail. Okay, what about lifestyle and environment? The sort of argument or statement you might read would be like this: no age has ever afforded more instances of corpulency than our own. This was stated by Thomas Short in 1727. So why is it that we now believe that there's this rampant increase in the incidence of obesity? Well, the data that supports this point of view is generated from sets such as this. 15% of the population was designated as being obese in 1976, and by 1999, the incidence of obesity had pretty much doubled. And you've all heard this trumpeted in the press with statements that further state that our genes haven't changed in this 2-decade interval, so it must be the environment that's causing this problem. First of all, this argument is incorrect from the point of view of natural selection. Natural selection can play out over very rapid time frames as nature winnows out the better suited and less well suited variants in a population. But there's a deeper problem with the way in which these data are presented, and it has to do with the fact that we all know body weight and adiposity is a continuous trait, meaning there's a continuum from high to low, but we're defining the problem with a fixed threshold. And that's using this metric known as BMI, which is weight over height squared, and what's shown here are representations of 5'10" men at different weights with their corresponding BMIs. And you're said to be obese if your BMI is above 30. If it's 29, you're not obese. Now, the problem with using a fixed threshold to define, to analyze a continuous trait is that if you have a distribution for it, the distribution doesn't have to move very far for you to get a disproportionate increase in the number of people who suffer from that condition. So let me explain what I mean in a less arcane way. So here's the threshold for obesity, BMI of 30. Here's the BMI in the US population in 1990. Average BMI 26.7, 23.3% of the population exceed the threshold. 10 years later, in 2000, the average BMI is 28.1, but now, because the curve shifted but this threshold didn't, 30% of the population is obese. So over the course of the 90s, there was a 33% increase in the incidence of obesity. Sounds profound, except for the fact that this was associated with an increase of only 1.4 BMI units, or 7 to 10 pounds. Now, I'm going to argue to you that 7 to 10 pound average weight gain in a population is important from a public health point of view. But you get a very different impression of this problem when you hear 33% increase in a decade as compared to average weight gain 7 to 10 pounds, which is within many of our range of personal experience. In addition, when these data are typically presented, they don't correct or they don't stratify for age and sex. And in a population that is aging, this could have a dramatic impact. So if you now correct for age and sex at all ages, shown here as BMI at ages 40 to 59, the distributions over that same decade don't look very different at all. Now, there's admittedly a definite increase in the number of people that exceed the threshold, and it's certainly an important objective to try to understand what in our environment might be accounting for this increase in the number of people who are just defined as being obese. But there's another question that underpins that I find more interesting and compelling, which is this. In an environment such as that today, where we all essentially have unlimited access to calories, why is weight so variable? How is it that when we all have free access, some individuals can weigh hundreds of pounds more than other individuals? And the answer to that question is almost certainly genes. Now, there are a number of ways to assess the genetic contributions to a trait in human. One is to ask, does it run in the family? And the answer for obesity is yes, it does. Obesity tends to run in the family. But you might argue people who are obese live in an environment where children will get freer access to food, and that this could be environmental, and you'd be right. But there's another way to look at it, and that's to ask, do adoptive children more closely resemble for obesity their biological parents or their adoptive parents? Well, they much more closely in that respect resemble their biological parents. And the final way in which you can assess the genetic contribution is to systematically compare the phenotype of identical or monozygotic to non-identical or dizygotic twins. And this picture makes the point that identical twins who share all their genes are much more alike than our dizygotic twins. Now you can use data of this sort to quantitate the genetic contribution, and this has been done for many traits. And if you now do this for obesity, it scores as being as or more hereditable than almost any trait that's been studied, with the possible exception of height. Genetic factors contribute more to the variance in body weight than they do for schizophrenia, diabetes, hypertension, alcoholism, heart disease, and others. Now, the opportunity that modern genetics provides is the ability to figure out what those genes actually are. And that, I think, is changing many aspects of medicine. And what I'd like to tell you about now is how the ability to figure out what these genes are is changing the way we think about obesity. And to do that, I want to tell you about a case report showing you a picture of the child that I began by showing you an image of. This child was first described by Steve O'Reilly and colleagues in Cambridge, England, as being of normal weight at birth, but he began to develop morbid obesity in infancy. He overate just constantly. His parents had to padlock the refrigerator. At the age of 4, he was already pre-diabetic and weighed 90 pounds. Now, this child came from an inbred family and had a similarly infected 8-year-old cousin who weighed 200 pounds at the age of 8. Now, when you see an extreme phenotype in an inbred family, you often conclude that this could have a genetic basis. And Steve O'Reilly and colleagues reasoned that the phenotype of this child resembled that of a genetically obese mouse strain that we had begun studying in the 1990s. This is a picture of the Obie mouse and 2 sibling littermates. The only difference between this animal and its sibling littermates is a defect in a single gene. And it leads this animal to weigh 3 times as much and have 5 times as much fat as lean littermates that lived in the same cage. In 1994, we identified the defective gene in these mice as a hormone known as leptin. I'll say more about how this works in a minute, but I'll state now simply that leptin is a hormone made by fat tissue. It reports information to the brain concerning the amount of energy stored as fat, so the brain can make adjustments in how much food you eat and how much energy you burn. So the amount of leptin you make is proportional to the fat mass, and if it increases, it suppresses appetite. If it decreases, it increases appetite. So once we identified the gene, the next question was, what happens if you give extra hormone back to these Obie mice? And here's what happens. An Obie mouse getting saline remains obese. You now give the hormone back to the Obie mouse, and it loses dramatic amounts of weight. So one of the things we tell obese people to do, eat less, can be controlled by this factor, and the other can too, because these animals normally have reduced activity, but now you give these animals leptin, and the first thing you see is not a reduced food intake, but increased activity. So here again, this hormone is controlling both of the factors that we normally accuse the obese of not restraining or not acting on appropriately. So based on this, we knew in animals that this gene and the hormone it encodes, leptin, could control several of the key elements that regulate body weight. And so O'Reilly and colleagues decided to give this hormone to that leptin deficient to the child. And indeed, they were able to show that the child failed to make leptin, much the same as the mice. And here's what happens. The child gets older. That has nothing to do with leptin. That's just the way things are. Despite getting taller, he got thinner, less fat, less diabetic. And they then did an experiment with this child before and after the first leptin dose. They put before this child a test meal of 2,000 calories, which is the number of calories an adult of my size would eat in a day. This child ate all 2,000 calories in a single setting and asked for more. After a few leptin doses, the child now ate an age-appropriate number of calories at that same test meal. So what was driving appetite in that child was not a lack of willpower. It was not a toxic environment. Rather, it was a lack of this hormone leptin. And as I'll tell you later, I think that genetic differences account for probably more than 10% of known cases of morbid obesity, and the final number was likely to be much higher. Now, what happened in this child is that a mutation in the leptin gene abrogates expression, so no signal is ever generated from fat that there are adequate fat stores. Low leptin stimulates food intake, reduces energy expenditure, more and more fat gets deposited, but it's to no avail. No signal is ever generated that allows the system to shut off. And now here's a picture of the child at the age of 8. These are the images that I began by showing you. These are the same child, and this illustrates, I hope you would agree, how powerful genetic factors can be in defining differences in weight. My own opinion is that genetic factors contribute in all of us to a very great extent. And we'll talk later about how we might think more deeply about environment and behavioral factors superimposed on this. But there's clearly a huge genetic underpinning to defining what we weigh. Now, the way the leptin system works, as best as we can tell, goes something like this. At your stable weight, you have a certain amount of fat and make a certain amount of leptin, and food intake is at an average level balanced against energy expenditure. Now imagine that you lose weight by dieting, fat mass and leptin level falls. I already showed you a low leptin level in this mutant child provides this potent stimulus to eat more, and so now you'll overeat voraciously until such time as fat mass and leptin level return to the starting point. Now imagine that you go on a binge of eating somewhere and you're a normal weight, leptin sensitive individual. Fat mass and leptin level will expand, and this will suppress food intake and body weight, again until such time as fat mass and leptin level return to the starting point. So what this represents is a mechanism that allows organisms, much as the same as I showed you for animals earlier, to maintain their weight within a range. Now, I'm not arguing here that leptin is the only factor that controls food intake and body weight, but I am arguing that it sets up a biological force that resists weight change in either direction. This is an unconscious drive to eat or not eat, and it's this biological force that dieters have to overcome by willpower if they're going to sustain the weight loss. Now, what's the biological purpose of this or the evolutionary significance? There's a very standard concept in biology dating to Claude Bernard known as homeostasis. There's some desire on the part of all organisms to maintain constant levels of every biological system or constant activities. And usually this is a result of the fact that, that natural selection selects for those variants that are best designed to avoid particular risks. So for the immune system, you would say it's balanced at a particular level because if it's not active enough, you'll get infections. If it's too active, you'll get autoimmune disease. And the same, I think, can be argued for obesity, that there's an advantage to maintaining body weight within a range, having in part to do with our origins as hunter-gatherers. So what were the risks in that environment? Well, if you're too lean, it's a problem. You could starve to death. But if you're obese, that also is a problem. It turns out a major cause of mortality in our forebears was dying at the mouths of predators. And so being too obese increased your relative risk of death by predation. Being too lean increased your risk of starvation. And so there's a happy medium, in a sense, of body fat that balances these two relative risks. There are still relative risks to each today. The nature of them is somewhat different, and in addition, these genes are carried into modernity. But it suggests that as would be the case for any other system, such as blood pressure, blood lipids, and others, that nature has sought biological means to maintain an optimal level of body fat. Now, one of the arguments that supports this line of reasoning and the role of leptin in it is that these obese children have a whole set of abnormalities, not just obesity. And it turns out in retrospect, all of the abnormalities that these children show are not those that are normally associated with obesity, but rather are associated with starvation. So this child, despite being obese, shows all of the signs and symptoms you would otherwise see in a starved individual. And this has led to the following line of reasoning, that when body weight falls, leptin level falls. A low leptin level not only stimulates increased food intake, but also activates a broad biological response, which we might think of as the response to starvation. And biological changes develop in each of these and many other organ systems. Decreased thyroid function, immune function, insulin signaling, and reproductive function. And the point of all of these changes is to save energy. So when you're starving, what happens? A signal is sent that makes you want to eat more, and also is sent to all other organs of the body to store energy, to save energy. And so what happens in the leptin deficient child is, even though the child is obese, this response is activated nonetheless, and leptin treatment not only suppresses food intake, but suppresses all these other changes. So what this has suggested is that adipose tissue is not simply a passive balloon, as many believed, collecting fat, as it were, but is rather a bona fide endocrine organ secreting a hormone that reports nutritional information to the brain and that in turn regulates the activity of probably every organ system in the body. Now, this line of thinking has led to a number of instances in which leptin therapy can be used to improve the conditions, and they're typically conditions associated with the absence of leptin, such as in that leptin deficient child. I should mention that leptin deficiency as a result of mutations is quite rare, but nonetheless leptin is quite effective in that setting. What I haven't told you about so far is leptin in obesity. And that's because, in contrast to the leptin deficient children, most obese individuals have high, not low leptin levels. So in this curve, what you see is increasing body fat, increasing leptin. Obese people typically have high levels of leptin. Now, what does this mean? Well, when you have high levels of a hormone, but no evident hormone effect, remember this hormone would normally act to reduce weight, you typically surmise that this is a situation known as hormone resistance. The hormone you make, for whatever reason, doesn't work well enough. And the classic example of this is type 2 diabetes. Most diabetics actually make extra insulin, not too little, and diabetes in that setting is a result of insulin resistance. And so this would suggest that obesity is the result of leptin resistance. What might this mean? Well, you have leptin normally acting on the brain, but let's imagine for the moment that there was a block to leptin action. So now what would happen is less effective signal would get through. You'd eat more, burn less energy, fat mass would increase, and you'd make more leptin, and re-equilibrate with decreased leptin activity, you'd re-equilibrate with more fat and more leptin. And all the available evidence suggests that this is what causes obesity, and indeed a number of instances or causes of leptin resistance are now known. Most are not. I'll come back to where these leptin resistance develops and what it might mean in a moment, but first let's think of the empiric question. Does giving extra leptin to people improve or reduce body weight? In the first such study, leptin was given alone. Remembering, if you have high levels of the hormone, it's arguable whether giving even more will have a beneficial effect or not. But in the first study of leptin, it looked kind of promising because at this high dose of leptin, you could actually reduce weight pretty significantly and statistically significantly in a significant number of obese patients, although the numbers in this study were quite small. The problem was that this dose of leptin was so high that it could never really be administered to people in a commercial setting. It would have required that people inject themselves twice a day with 2 milliliters of a leptin solution. And that just wasn't commercially viable. And the problem was the lower doses, which you could administer in reasonable amounts, didn't appear to have the efficacy. And so here things languished for a number of years. There were a number of approaches that, however, could be taken. The first is to see if there are any people who are super sensitive to leptin, and it does appear to be that there are some individuals who in fact are quite sensitive. But another possibility would be to see if there might be other agents that can somehow restore leptin sensitivity, so-called leptin sensitizers, analogous to insulin sensitizers for the treatment of diabetes. And indeed, there does appear to be at least one leptin sensitizer, and to tell you about that, I need to say a little bit more about the system that regulates food intake and body weight. Leptin is not the only factor. Body weight and food intake are regulated by what are referred to as short-term and long-term systems. The long-term system is comprised mainly of leptin and its downstream mediators, and it's the job of this system to regulate the amount of fat that's stored. But there's also a short-term system whose job it is to maintain high levels of nutrients in blood over the course of the day and during an overnight fast. It's this set of short-term signals that controls how hungry you get between meals and when you'll initiate a meal, and how quickly you'll get satiated or terminate a meal. And there are a number of such short-term signals that have been identified, including insulin, a peptide amylin I'll say more about, other peptides some of you may have heard of known as CCK and ghrelin, as well as neural factors. So all these hormonal and neural factors and maybe metabolic signals inform your brain essentially about when your last meal was, and this system in turn interacts with the long-term system to maintain optimal nutritional state. Now, there's been an argument made for a number of years that effective treatment of obesity will require that you target both systems, the idea being that if you target just the short-term system, the long-term system will compensate and vice versa. And I'm going to tell you now about the results of a combination between leptin and one of these short-term signals known as amylin. Amylin is a peptide that's marketed for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. It has synergistic effects with insulin, and the way it works is to suppress glucagon, a pro-diabetic hormone, to reduce glucose absorption, and also to suppress food intake by acting on centers in the brain. In patients receiving amylin, it's been observed that there's a 5% durable weight loss. So this does have efficacy. And so in recent clinical trials, amylin has now been combined with leptin, and the results are actually pretty encouraging. While each agent by itself yields about a 5% weight loss, the combination resulted in 13% weight loss. This is, to my knowledge, the most efficacy that's been seen for any agent in a clinical trial or pair of agents. I should disclose that I consult for amylin, and so I don't want to say anything more about other than that this is encouraging enough to have led amylin and their corporate partners to now begin subsequent or further trials to confirm that this combination does reproducibly deliver the efficacy shown here and is safe. And the answer to those questions won't be known for several more years, although a repeat trial of the size of this one did replicate the efficacy that was reported. So it does appear that leptin could be part of a clinical regimen at some point in time as part of a combination, and time will tell. Now, the final question, or the real objective here, would be to understand what really causes leptin resistance and see if we could undo it in a less empiric way than simply combining leptin with other agents. Now, this is going to be a tall task because leptin normally acts on sets of nerve cells in the brain to regulate behavior. So to really understand what causes leptin resistance, we're going to have to know the full aggregate of neurons on which it normally acts, and then understand what effects are abrogated or reduced in the leptin resistant state. Now, in the 15 years since leptin has been cloned, we've learned a great deal about the nature of these neural pathways, and I want to tell you about one set of pathways now because they have important explanatory power for the genetics of obesity. Leptin acts on two known classes of neurons in the hypothalamus to regulate weight. Hormones act by activating receptors on the surface of cells, and one neuron nerve cell that expresses the leptin receptor expresses a peptide NPY, and this peptide stimulates feeding. A second class of nerve cells expresses a different peptide, MSH, and this peptide acts on a different receptor, the MC4 receptor, to reduce feeding. Leptin works by inhibiting these neurons and activating these neurons. So in the absence of leptin, such as in that obese child, this pathway will be maximally active, this pathway will be off, and the child will eat more. If you give leptin, it suppresses the activity of these neurons, activates these neurons, and now you'll eat less. And moreover, the system appears to be tuned so that quantitative changes in leptin concentration change the balance between these pathways and regulate feeding in a quantitative way. So in a sense, this is the way the basic drive to eat is represented. You have nerve cells that activate feeding, you have nerve cells that inhibit feeding, and leptin and other agents change the balance in the activity of these two pathways. Now, the reason these pathways have attracted a great deal of attention in recent years is that mutations in it cause human obesity. And that's not just leptin, but the leptin receptor, this peptide MSH, and the MC4 receptor. While there are only a few dozen cases of leptin deficiency worldwide, we now know that 10% of morbid human obesity is a result of mutations in one of these genes, most of which are the leptin receptor or this MC4 receptor. 10% of morbid human obesity can be accounted for by a mutation in genes we already know about. And there's very good reason to believe that in coming years, increasing numbers of genetic alterations that lead to obesity will be identified. I think this is I know that this is a bigger number than that can account for any other complex trait in terms of Mendelian inheritance, and means that a very significant number of a proportion of the time where someone might make a judgment about the causes of obesity, they'd be wrong, because it would have a confirmed biological basis. And I think in the rest of the population, there's also a genetic basis. We just don't know what they are yet. And so the future puts forth the promise that this number will continue to grow, and we'll learn more and more about the biological underpinnings of this system. Now, there are many questions that remain, and perhaps the deepest one is this. No one believes that the decision about whether or not to eat in a human occurs in the hypothalamus. This is sort of a relay station for nutritional information. In human, feeding is much more complex. Actually, in all organisms, it's more complex than this, because feeding is what's known as a complex motivational behavior. What this means is that many factors influence the likelihood that you'll initiate the behavior, but no single factor guarantees it. This is in contrast to a reflex where a defined stimulus gives an invariant response. So for feeding in human, many factors are important. The hormonal systems I mentioned a moment ago, including leptin, but sensory factors are important: smell, visual factors, taste. Emotional factors are clearly important, as are voluntary factors, the conscious desire to eat less or more. Now, the notion has been put forth that since there are many factors that regulate feeding and influence the likelihood, that there must be a part of the brain that processes all this information and converts it into a decision that's adaptive: eat or don't eat. Not only do we not know how complex information of this sort is represented in the brain and integrated, we don't even know where in the brain it's regulated or integrated. So one of the real deep questions going forward will be to understand how and where is this decision made. And we may have a means for studying this by following downstream the effects of leptin, because leptin acts on a discrete number of responding cells and has a measurable effect on food intake. And so the question is going to be what happens in between. Now, there's a research vignette I'm going to go through very quickly now to illustrate how we can begin to approach this, but I'm going to go through it quickly because I want to end more or less on time and have time for a few questions. But basically what we can now do in the laboratory is use artificial means to activate nerve cells in an animal, and by activating those nerve cells we can ask what's the effect of the behavior. And the nerve cells we started by looking at were cells in a part of the brain known as the reward center, where activation of these pathways can increase particular behaviors, and it's this site, the VTA, that's part of the system that responds to drugs of abuse. Now what we do here in this experiment is we deliver into particular cells a channel that's activated by light. And so when you shine a light on this channel, sodium flows in and you can activate a given neuron. So there are experimental means for putting these channels into your neurons of interest, and so we put this channel into neurons in a region of the brain known as the midbrain. And what we do is something interesting. We basically put a cannula into that region of the brain that will fire a light, and when the light fires, it'll activate the channel. And now what we do is configure the system in such a way that every time the animal licks, it fires the laser, and we'll see what happens. So here's a picture of the device that measures the number of licks. And remember, every time the animal licks, it fires a light, and the light activates the neurons. And here's what happens. I don't know if you'll be able to see this because of the lights. I don't think you can see it so well, but you see the light lighting up now, and the animal starts to lick. So what it means is we can activate a behavior by simply activating a particular nerve cell. Let me play it again for you. Can you turn the lights down? So the animal isn't licking, no light. It licks, the light goes on, and that provides a stimulus to eat more. And here's what the data look like. This is the animal when the laser is not coupled to licking, and here's what happens when it's coupled. It licks obsessively. Now we're using this approach now to activate nerve activity in specific nerve cells, including the ones I told you about. And I think the hope moving forward is going to be that we can begin to piece together how the activity of specific neurons drive behavior, not just in this part of the brain known as the hypothalamus, but in higher centers of the brain. And I think these sorts of tools are going to give us the ability in the future to really dissect how it is complex behaviors are regulated. Now, while much needs to be learned about how it is that the behavior is generated, I want to close by telling you that despite these, the need to learn more about this, we've learned a lot about the physiologic system that regulates weight, and it's a simple thermostat-like mechanism. Body weight is regulated by a hormonal system in part comprised of leptin, which reports nutritional information to centers in the brain that then elicit behavioral and metabolic changes in response to it. Think of it as a thermostat. Your brain is set to expect a certain amount of leptin. If there's too little leptin, it will try to increase it, and if there's too much leptin, it'll try to decrease it by changing food intake and weight. Now, this is a powerful, I think, platform with which to think about how weight is regulated, not just because it has explanatory power in a number of patients, but it also provides a framework for considering how environmental and behavioral factors influence this system. So I think that a deeper understanding of the biology not only is important for its own sake, but enables, I think, a deeper consideration of how these other factors interact. Now, I believe that it's only a deeper understanding of this that will lead to newer treatments. The advice the obese typically get now goes something like this: they should eat less and exercise more. This advice was put forth first by Hippocrates 2,000 years ago. And I'd like to propose that modern science might be able to deliver more than simply repeating a 2,000-year-old recommendation. And so what we should do for this problem is what we would for any other medical problem. Understand the biological underpinning of the problem, understand the molecular alterations in that system that account for the pathophysiologic state. Of course, think about how environmental, developmental, and other factors might influence, and from this develop rational therapies. Now, I'm often asked by people, well, because this takes time, what should we do in the meantime? And so the advice I give in advance of better medical therapies is this. 1, stop focusing on your weight and focus on health. That's what should be most important. Well, what can we do to improve our health? Everyone should exercise and eat a heart-healthy diet. For the obese who suffer medical consequences, they should try to lose some weight. There is a disproportionate health benefit to modest, achievable weight loss of even 7 to 10 pounds. The system I'm talking about doesn't regulate weight to the pound, and I think it basically sets a range in which we comfortably operate. And if you're within your range and can lose some weight, that is often sufficient to improve health. Don't berate yourself if you can't normalize your weight. You're fighting against a powerful biological system. And of course, don't berate anyone else either. Now, this is the message I try to deliver, and did so in a Newsweek editorial, Newsweek editorial about a year ago. And here was the tagline, which is more or less what I tried to communicate. It's not gluttony, it's genetics. Why our moralizing misses the point? Well, it was really fun to watch because this became the most discussed article on the Newsweek website for weeks afterwards, most emailed, most commented on. And I pulled some of the comments from the website because they're informative in terms of what the public view of what I just told you is. So I'll share some of these with you by way of closing. This is crap. What a complete load of apologistic crap. Crap was really, I did a tally, that was the most popular word on the comments list. Ditto to the hogwash. This is my favorite. I smell, so you have detractors, I found, and then defenders. So I Smell Smoke wrote, I'll bet Dr. Friedman's buddies don't call him skinny. And then T. Masson wrote, and I bet Smoke's buddies don't call him smart. I don't think how I live my life is anyone else's business. My obesity is not hurting anyone else. I often wonder if people vilify obese people because they're so visibly obvious, and nothing makes you feel better than pointing out the mote in someone else's eye. And the last one I think is actually the most interesting. Tulkin, why Tulkin? Writes, are we animals or do we have an intellect and the ability to choose how we behave? I think as people we have this deep-seated wish to believe that we control ourselves and that we get to decide who we are and what we do. And I think people find it disconcerting, or many people find it disconcerting, to think that there are basic drives that can dominate our conscious wish to do otherwise. And so I think this underpins a lot of the hostility that people feel to the obese, because it reminds us of something we don't always want to be reminded of, which is that we're basically carry with us all the basic drives of any other animal species, and that they have a lot, or probably as much, to do with how we behave as anything else. So I'd like to thank you for the invitation to come and visit you, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Before we go to questions, I have 3 short comments to say. First, there are some people who need to be thanked for this. So first, the Silversteins, who provided the funding to make this lecture series possible. Second, the people in the Center for Genetic Medicine. Peter Kopp, the interim director, leads the organization and does a terrific job. Some of the staff who worked very hard to make this happen, Beth Herbert and Megan Boyle. And yeah, that's the people we need to thank. Next thing is that each of you probably received a little survey form. It's very helpful for us if you fill out the survey form. We value your input on making this lecture series as good as it possibly can be. And then lastly, for questions, and I won't be able to let you guys ask too many questions because Dr. Friedman has to catch an airplane. There are microphones that will be floating around. Use a microphone because this is being recorded. We won't be able to have the questions on the tape if you don't use the microphone. So first question in the back, if we can. Okay, first person with a microphone.
First of all, I just want to say that was a fantastic talk, and I really appreciate you coming here to give it to us. The question is, one of the recommendations you made is for people to eat a heart-healthy diet. So my question is, what is a heart-healthy diet? And specifically, I think the American Medical Association and American Heart Association recommend low-fat diets, while others have suggested that low-carbo diets are better. Can you comment on that?
Okay, so I mean, that was a perspicacious question, because what I'm really saying is this. There's very good evidence that what you eat, the composition of your diet, can have a very important impact on your heart health. So low cholesterol, low saturated fats improve your heart health. There is absolutely no evidence that I know of that the composition of your diet actually influences the likelihood that you'll develop obesity. Now, everyone's intuition, and mine too probably, is that eating too much McDonald's makes it more likely that you'll gain weight and become obese. But actually, there's no evidence to that effect. And so you can't, based on the available evidence, tell people, eat these particular nutrients because you're less likely to become obese. And so my view personally is actually it probably doesn't matter what you eat, it's rather how many calories you eat, because they're all interconvertible. So I think if you stick to what we know, the advice should be eat those things that improve your heart health, and don't make the assumption that what you eat is going to make any difference in how much you weigh. And it's a longer conversation about Atkins versus Pritikin, but the fact is, at the same time as some people say eat less carbohydrate, you won't get fat, other people are saying eat more carbohydrate or you won't get fat. And sooner or later someone is going to say don't eat any protein and you won't get fat. It's just a matter, it's a book waiting to be written.
Really enjoyed your talk back here. You made a pretty compelling case for the genetics and biological basis for obesity. And you presented some evidence that there has been a change in BMI, relatively modest effect, and it seems like you were attributing much of this, some of it, to aging. Independent of aging of the population, what is the most compelling evidence for any environmental influence on BMI or obesity?
Well, the argument I typically get from people is, when I make this argument, is they say, yeah, fine, but have you been to Disney World? Because you go to Disney World and you make anecdotal observations about what the population looks like. Of course, that doesn't tell you whether it's actually changed because maybe you weren't looking in quite the same way 20 years ago. I think actually what's changing, my opinion, is that certain demographic groups carry different gene pools and are more susceptible to obesity than other groups. And in our population, those groups oftentimes are those that are now getting free access to calories in the way they didn't before. So I think no one's done this because it may not be politically correct, although some epidemiologists have. I think that it might be useful to know whether the increase in incidence are restricted to particular segments of our population and not others, and I suspect that would account for a lot of it. I think I made that sufficiently vague that you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. Good.
To make it a little more concrete, perhaps you could comment if you're aware of research in the area on the Pima Indians.
Well, okay, that's precisely what I was driving at. So it turns out that Aboriginal populations tend to be the most susceptible to increasing obesity and diabetes rates when exposed to a high-fat diet. And this has partly to do with this argument about genes that are selected for when there's a high risk of starvation. And so the segments of our population that appear to be developing the most obesity are those segments that carry in them more rather than less Aboriginal genes. And so I think that's seen in many cases among Hispanic Americans, which has been documented, and to a lesser extent, but also in a documented way among African Americans. And so gene pools of every population are different, and different populations, on average at least, have seen free access to calories at different points, and I think that accounts for some of the trends over time.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. Over here. Hi. My question is regarding the data that you presented on the fact that the increase in obesity between the 70s and now, is that referencing an American population? And if it also, kind of to piggyback on that, if you are looking at these, talking about differences in different demographic groups, would you say that, say, a European population or population in the South, for instance, they have a different sort of gene expression for governing these types of...
So that's a really good question. And the genesis, so when I had the original idea to think about the data in this way, it actually came from some slides that a scientist named Mike Brown showed about cholesterol, because you can do this for cholesterol, high blood pressure. This is a common problem when you define a continuous trait in a dichotomous manner. So the idea I had was maybe the US has one curve and Europe has another, and the differences that we think are so great may not be so great if you look at the distributions rather than cutoffs. So I contacted a woman who works at the NIH Bureau of Statistics named Catherine Flegel, who's the lead author on all of these epidemiologic reports. And I called her so I could do that direct comparison of Europe to the US. And I called her with some trepidation because I didn't want the lead US epidemiologist on this topic telling me I was full of it. Well, I called her, and believe it or not, she told me two things. One, the data are not available from Europe in a way that you can cross-compare. It may be available now, but I've never gone back to look into it. So I don't know the answer to the question about different cross-sections of populations, although it is the case that all of these same countries are now reporting explosive increases in obesity too. So I suspect when you really look carefully, the differences aren't as great as we sometimes believe. But the other thing she told me that was interesting was that she's been trying to make the same case that I'm making now based on the data. That the data actually suggests at their core that there's a gene-environment interaction, which is another way of saying part of what I'm saying. And that despite her belief, the fact that her beliefs are almost identical to mine in this regard, that no one is listening to her. And she's done some other more clever ways of looking at the data to confirm what's happening, but I'd have to tell you about that some other time.
And I'm afraid it will have to be another time. Dr. Friedman has to go. We also have another crew coming in, another seminar coming. So let's thank Dr. Friedman.